Dawn, August 22nd, 1914. Somewhere along the Belgian-French border, a line of infantry moves forward at a walking pace. Blue coats, red trousers, bayonets fixed and gleaming even in the mist. No one has told them to take cover. No one has dug a trench. Their orders are simple: advance and do not stop. They believe because their generals believe it, because their instructors drilled it into them for a decade, that the will to attack is itself a weapon. That courage, pressed forward relentlessly, can break any line. By nightfall, more Frenchmen will be dead than on any other single day in the nation's military history. Over 27,000 of them. And this is only the first month on only one front. 400 miles away, a different army is digging in behind concrete and barbed wire, trusting firepower over spirit. Further east, a third army is racing forward before it's even finished mobilizing, betting that sheer numbers can outrun its own broken supply lines. And across the channel, a small professional army is about to discover that everything it trained for is already obsolete. 4 armies, 4 completely different ideas of how to win a war. This is the story of how each one collided with reality, and what was left of each doctrine by the time the guns finally fell silent. France, the cult of the offensive. To understand why an army marched into machine guns in bright red trousers, you have to understand what France believed about war itself. After the humiliation of 1871, French military thinkers didn't just want a new strategy, they wanted a new philosophy of the soldier. Defense, fortification, dug-in firepower, all of it was recast as weakness of spirit. What mattered was elan, dash, momentum, the moral force of men who refused to hesitate. The doctrine had a name, offensive outrance, the offensive without limits, and it became the entire foundation of France's war plan, Plan 17. But the Germans waiting in the fog that August morning weren't testing anyone's willpower. They were dug in, concealed, and armed with machine guns that didn't care how much courage was walking toward them. In one division alone, 11 out of every 15 men were killed or wounded before the sun was fully up. Multiply that morning across a dozen villages along the frontier, and within a month, France had lost close to 1/3 men, killed, wounded, or missing. Roughly the population of a mid-sized city, gone in 4 weeks. France had built an army to win with spirit. It was about to relearn war with shovels. Germany, from one grand plan to 1,000 small decisions. Germany entered the war trusting a different kind of certainty. The Schlieffen Plan, a single, precisely timed maneuver meant to knock France out in 6 weeks before Russia could even finish mobilizing. It was a war won on paper, by railway timetables. It survived contact with the enemy for about a month. Once the front froze into trenches, Germany faced the same wall everyone else did, but its answer wasn't more courage. It was more flexibility. Small assault teams began experimenting as early as 1915. Instead of marching in long exposed lines, a handful of men would slip through the weakest points in enemy defenses, bypass strong points entirely, and let follow-up waves mop up what was left behind. By 1917, these stormtroop methods had a name and a doctrine. By the spring of 1918 in Operation Michael, they broke a static front that hadn't moved in years, advancing 40 miles in 2 weeks, something neither side had managed since 1914. It was, tactically, one of the most effective innovations of the entire war. And it still wasn't enough, because a doctrine that could rupture a line couldn't yet supply, reinforce, or exploit what it broke through. The infantry kept outrunning their own artillery and their own logistics, and each time the gains bled out. Germany had solved how to break the trench deadlock. It never solved what to do after. Britain learning war by the numbers. Britain didn't arrive in 1914 with a grand doctrine at all. It arrived with a small professional army built for colonial policing, not for facing the largest conscript armies in Europe. That army was nearly wiped out within months. What replaced it wasn't a philosophy, it was a spreadsheet. British commanders spent the middle years of the war relearning combat as an industrial problem. How many shells per yard of trench? How far artillery could realistically protect advancing infantry? How to synchronize a creeping wall of shell fire with men walking just behind it. Early attempts were catastrophic. Badly timed barrages, uncut wire, infantry sent forward with no real fire support. But by 1917, a more disciplined method emerged. bite and hold. Instead of trying to break the line in one heroic push, attacks were limited to what artillery could actually protect, seize a modest objective, dig in immediately, and let the inevitable German counterattack walk straight into a prepared barrage. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't produce dramatic breakthroughs. But it worked, repeatedly, and by 1918, it had become one of the building blocks of the final Allied advance. Britain's doctrine wasn't courage, and it wasn't infiltration. It was arithmetic, refined under fire until it was reliable. Russia, the steamroller that never left the station, no army entered the war with a more terrifying reputation than Russia's. Millions of reserves, an empire that could theoretically field endless replacements. Europe called it the Russian steamroller, and both allies and enemies planned around it. France, in particular, was counting on Russia to attack fast enough to pull German troops away from the Western Front. So Russia did, before it was ready. Its armies pushed into East Prussia within weeks of mobilization, racing a supply and communication system that hadn't caught up with them. Russian railways used a different gauge than German ones, so supplies had to be unloaded and reloaded by hand at the border. There weren't enough telephone wires or trained signal officers, so entire armies sometimes lost contact with each other for days. Some Russian commanders were reduced to sending orders over open radio, uncoded, which the Germans simply listened to. The result was catastrophe at Tannenberg, an entire Russian army encircled and destroyed. The steamroller wasn't broken by German superiority in numbers. It was broken by everything behind the front line: the rails, the wires, the shells that weren't there. Russia had the manpower to fight the war it wanted. It never built the logistics to fight it. The convergence. By 1918, something strange had happened to all four of these doctrines. The elan that was supposed to win the war for France was gone, replaced by the same careful artillery-led methods everyone else had adopted. Germany's infiltration tactics had been absorbed and echoed by the very armies they were designed to defeat. The British and French were now using their own version of small unit, artillery-supported advances. Britain's patient bite and hold arithmetic and Germany's fast infiltration had, from opposite directions, arrived at something similar: combined arms warfare, where infantry, artillery, aircraft, and eventually tanks moved as one coordinated system instead of one heroic mass. Russia never got the chance to complete that evolution. Its army broke first, not on the battlefield alone, but under the weight of everything the doctrine had never accounted for. 4 armies went to war in 1914 with 4 different answers to the same question: what actually wins a battle? Willpower, maneuver, firepower, mass. By 1918, 3 of those answers had been tested, broken, rebuilt, and merged into something none of the pre-war generals would have recognized. The 4th answer collapsed an empire. Doctrine, it turns out, was never just a military question. It was each nation's assumption about what kind of people its soldiers were and what kind of war the century would allow them to fight. Reality corrected every single one of them, and it billed the difference in human lives.